didn't know how to respond properly, and that this was trauma we were dealing with, and the best way to, team up with her to help her through that trauma. And so unfortunately, the way I responded made it worse. And the way I responded was usually with anger, because I was rejected over and over. And, underneath anger is usually hurt of some kind. My anger then made her feel even more unsafe, which made her distance herself physically even further. And it just created a vicious cycle for us.
You're listening to Get Your Marriage On, the fun and spicy podcast bringing you new tools and fresh ideas so that you can be the sexiest couple you know.
One source I found states that 1 in 5 women experience sexual assault or unwelcome sexual attention in their life. And some of this can lead to trauma. Trauma from sexual abuse is ugly, is awful, and is not something people enjoy talking about. The trauma that comes from sexual abuse can interfere with a healthy and thriving sexual relationship. Today, my guest is Dr. Wyatt Fisher, a marriage therapist that specializes in helping individuals overcome, heal from, and thrive after a history of sexual abuse. He has a really interesting story. He was studying to be a therapist. He met his wonderful wife. They fell in love, got married, and within a few months, it became apparent that the sexual abuse that she experienced as a child early on had a big impact on their marriage. And he talks about his story, about how he approached, her trauma in the beginning was actually making things worse. And then also what actually did work and what steps they both took to heal from it. Although sexual abuse isn't part of my life or my wife's history, there's been many things that I found valuable in this episode anyway. For instance, I love the story Dr. Wyatt shares about how he became more compassionate about his wife's situation. I also love that although trauma from sexual abuse is very serious, healing from abuse is also seriously cool and possible. And how important creating a safe emotional connection and steps you can take for two people to get more comfortable in their own skin and see each other as an ally instead of an enemy in that moment, how important those things are. Dr. Wyatt Fisher, welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
Doing good, Dan. Thanks for having me.
This is great. To introduce you to our audience, can you tell us how you met your wife?
Well, we were both students at CU Boulder, and you wouldn't believe it now, but I was a big party animal in that stage of my life and had hair down to my shoulders and would kind of lead the masses to party after party. And I was in the dorms, and we had 2 male clusters at the end, and then the rest of the floor was women, and I was most attracted to her. And I just remember trying to get her attention any way I could. And we actually, one thing I just remembered, we started playing inner tube water polo. We joined a league, our floor. And I remember I kept teaming up with her, and we would kind of play footsies under the water and just kind of flirting with each other. And we went off one day just to have some time together. And Folsom Field, which is the football stadium there at CU Boulder, was left open one day. And we snuck into it and had the whole stadium to ourselves. And so we're just playing around on the grass, rolling around. And
was this at night?
This was during the day. Actually.
Okay.
So we had a very explosive beginning that was very magical. And like a lot of new partners, we thought our relationship was going to be invincible, easy, no problems were going to come. And we had no idea what we were up against in our future.
So what were you up against?
Well, my wife had a lot of unhealed sexual trauma from her upbringing that was dormant until we got married. And like a lot of trauma, trauma often doesn't surface until the person feels very secure, because then it surfaces because they feel able to process or express that trauma. And so none of her sexual trauma was evident when we were dating. But after we got married, it came out with full force.
That's interesting. Why does trauma stay dormant until it's secure? That's not what I would have thought.
Yeah. It may depend on the person, but oftentimes it does stay dormant because it's too risky to express that trauma or live out that trauma. Yeah. So people kind of keep it under wraps, sometimes probably subconsciously. But then when they get into a long-term secure relationship, such as marriage, they often feel safe to really become themselves, really let out whatever's inside of them. And that's what happened in our experience.
In what way did her trauma express itself?
She wanted nothing to do with sex.
Okay,
Yeah. So
gotcha.
shortly after we got married, we could tell something was wrong where
Hmm.
she wanted nothing to do with sexual intimacy. She avoided sexual intimacy. She would get angry at me for wanting sexual intimacy because I'm the higher libido partner. So that was within like the first year or two of our marriage, and that just set up a lot of toxic patterns for us
Hmm.
early in our relationship.
At that time, I'm sure that's like a big struggle, especially newlywed and trying to, adjust to life together.
Yeah.
Um, what were those conversations like at that time?
Yeah, at the time, I was just starting graduate school to become a therapist. And
Hmm.
so I didn't know how to respond properly and that this was trauma we were dealing with and the best way to, team up with her to help her through that trauma. And so, unfortunately, the way I responded made it worse. And the way I responded was usually with anger because I was rejected over and over. And, underneath anger is usually hurt of some kind, some type of
Hmm.
soft feeling. And so I was definitely just feeling a lot of hurt, a lot of rejection. And instead of staying in my tender underbelly, what I expressed it with anger. And
Hmm.
my anger then made her feel even more unsafe, which made her distance herself physically even further. The
Hmm.
more she distanced herself, the angrier I became, and it just created a vicious cycle for us.
Gotcha. In addition to the anger, did you have a lot of resentment towards her
Oh
and
yeah,
in the marriage?
absolutely.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like it was all her fault. Like I can't believe all this trauma was brought into our relationship. I wish I would have known this when we were dating. How can you shut down physical intimacy in our relationship? Like it's one of my top needs to feel loved and connected. And so I had huge areas of resentment toward her. And in that time, I was feeling like this is all her fault.
Mhm. At
And so,
what point did at what point did she share with you about her trauma as a child?
it didn't really come out until after we were married, the full extent.
Hmm.
And when we started hitting all these roadblocks of physical intimacy, here and there, she would start sharing about these childhood memories she had of unwanted sexual experiences. She had multiple.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, a lot of the detail didn't come out until we started having all these problems.
Gotcha. How did you react when you heard those things?
It was helpful on the one hand
Uh
because
huh.
it created more empathy
Uh huh.
for me with why she was having these struggles. Um, but at the same time, we were left with the reality still of her rejecting all physical intimacy. And
Hmm.
so, on the one hand, it was helpful, but it also didn't fix
Solve
our,
anything.
didn't really solve our current challenges. And it was so traumatic for her that her coping mechanism was to avoid.
Hmm.
Like she didn't even want to tackle the sexual intimacy topic in our marriage because it was so traumatic for her. And so her tendency was to avoid.
Hmm.
And then because it was such a big area for me, I would constantly pursue,
Hmm.
get rejected, get angry, and then that made her avoid even more.
Did that affect like non-sexual touch and like outside the bedroom intimacy too? I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because sexual intimacy was so traumatic for her, it made her also shut down affection because
Hmm.
she was worried if I'm affectionate, he's going to want to have sexual contact, which I don't want. And so I'm not going to be affectionate either. And so it shut down not only the bedroom, but also all types of touch outside the bedroom.
So you're waking up like this is different than the woman I was rolling around in the grass at the stadium with. Like
Oh, yeah.
such a
It,
different person.
it was a
Uh-huh.
180.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
180. Yeah. And it also hurt our emotional intimacy because we were always very close emotionally. We always
Hmm.
had that strong connection as friends.
Hmm.
But once the physical broke apart, it also created these walls within us emotionally as well. So it had a ripple effect.
And this is one thing I think people don't really recognize, but there's a correlation or a parallel or a connection between the emotional intimacy and the physical intimacy.
Oh, yeah,
Would you agree with that?
absolutely. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. Most people, especially if they're middle to lower libido, can't be physically intimate until they feel emotionally connected first.
Hmm.
And so it goes hand in hand. So if the emotional breaks down, the physical breaks down. If the physical breaks down, the emotional breaks down. And then you have a vicious cycle.
Right. And the amount of physical intimacy the relationship can tolerate usually corresponds with the amount of emotional intimacy the relationship can the capacity in that relationship for it too.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, so without the physical, you'll see a breakdown of that emotional.
Right.
At what point did he? At what point did he hit rock bottom?
It took a while. I'm kind of hard headed and I can be pretty
Uh-huh.
stubborn. And it made it worse that I was studying to be a therapist because I kept thinking I can be our therapist.
I'll fix you.
I can fix this. I can fix us. I can fix you.
Uh-huh.
And so I was under that delusion for a long time. And that was a mistake because that prolonged us getting help for years and years. Me thinking, oh, I'm learning this stuff at school. I know I can do this.
Uh-huh.
But obviously I can't because I was not objective because I'm in
Uh-huh.
the relationship.
And you have an agenda.
I have an agenda. My needs are at stake. And so all my feedback was skewed.
Mhm.
So it took a while. And because of that, though, things got worse and worse. And then we just kind of learned to coexist,
Mhm.
in this really empty, loveless marriage for
Mhm.
several years. And then we almost became numb to it. And then, things just continually eroded and broke down until finally my wife was more open to seeking out professional help before I was because of everything I just said. But because of that slow erosion over time, eventually I was willing as well. And that's when we started reaching out for professional help.
Mhm.
And that began the beginning to our recovery.
In some ways, was that like a hard pill for you to swallow? Like you had to set your ego aside, that you
It,
yourself of
it was,
training to be a professional to
yeah,
go see another professional for yourself?
yes, it was hard. And even though my counseling program encouraged everyone to get their own counseling, and I did
Mhm.
that, there was times where I got my own counseling because they say every counselor needs a counselor.
Mhm.
So I did that individually. But then when it came to my marriage, I thought like, oh, this is the area where I want to help couples. I can help us. And
Mhm.
I just was delusional. And so, it did take a while to set that aside and realize I can't help us. Like we need
Mhm.
an objective third party to speak into this.
Gotcha. Now, let's talk about your wife's experience. What were some of the things in therapy that really helped her?
I think it was helpful. I mean, we went to therapy for about 5 years, first of
Okay.
all. And we saw multiple different therapists until we found one that we really connected with and was really helping. I think a couple things helped. I think one thing on her side, she went back to a lot of that original pain and trauma because she saw an individual therapist as well for her
Mhm.
trauma. So she did a lot of trauma therapy for her original trauma. And so I think that was a helpful piece for her. I think it was also helpful to have a therapist when we were in couples counseling to speak truth
Mhm.
and to be able to say to her, that expectation's unrealistic, or that approach there is not going to be sustainable, or you're kind of thinking Wyatt should be able to read your mind, or
Mhm.
that approach is not going to work. So having someone else say those kinds of things, helping her kind of see some of my innocence,
Mhm.
was helpful because, and this is so common with trauma. When you have trauma, often you project all of that hurt and negativity onto your partner.
Okay.
It's easy to project it onto your partner. So you often know how much trauma someone has by how they interpret their partner's behavior. The
Hmm.
more unhealed trauma they have growing up, the more likely they're going to have skewed interpretations of their partner's behavior because it's tapping into this unhealed trauma from their past.
Gotcha.
And that happened a lot with us. So I would, just do something like initiate intimacy or initiate even cuddling or anything in that direction. And in her mind, I was doing outrageous, like hurtful, me being selfish, me being,
Taking, or whatever.
taking, terrible person.
Mhm.
And so often it was all of her negative, hurtful things in her past was getting pushed on to me as her partner. And
Hmm.
then those things were hard for me to hear. And again, because I wasn't trained yet, I wasn't able to discern, oh, that's from her trauma. It
Mhm.
all felt very personal to me, which is why it was so hurtful. But working with a therapist, they were able to point that out.
Mhm.
Like, wait a minute, that's not Wyatt doing that. That sounds like what you felt toward that person in your upbringing, but you're thinking Wyatt's doing the same thing.
Mm.
So having someone speak truth into that was really helpful.
Can we talk about projection just a little bit more
Sure.
in case our listeners don't understand that term? because I think couples do this a lot,
Yeah.
all the time. What is projection, and how does that manifest a lot in like the couples you see?
Yeah. Projection is when you think your partner is doing something and they're really not. And that's really what projection is. So you'll say your partner hurts your feelings because they don't spend time with you and you thought they were going to. You can't change the fact, right? And the fact is your partner didn't spend time with you. What you can work on, though, and what happens a lot, is our interpretation of what that means.
Mm-hmm.
That's where projection comes in. So if you have a hurtful past, unhealed trauma, you may interpret your partner's behavior like this: they just don't love me
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't spend time with me, or they abandoned me because they didn't spend time with me that day. Normally, you're projecting when your interpretation or your reaction to something is stronger than what is warranted.
Gotcha.
And so that can be a common signal that I'm projecting onto my partner when my reaction to them is stronger than what seems warranted with what they've done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's projection.
Like I heard a story about a couple where the husband started accusing his wife of having an affair. He had really no evidence for it, but like just like, I think you're flirting with other men. And she's like, no, I'm not. And turns out he had an outside attraction that he was trying to manage with another woman himself.
Oh,
And it was something he's really struggling with. So it gets projected onto your partner in
yeah.
that way. So again, like what you said, it's like starting to, blame your spouse for things they're not doing or blowing up things bigger than they are. But really it's a reflection of what's you're trying to deal with inside that's
Right.
unresolved.
Yeah. So it can come from different directions. That one's an interesting example because it's almost like I feel guilty and I'm going to put it on you. It's like displacement. Projection in the sense that I'm referring to is more of I have unhealed hurts in my past that I've been wounded, and your behavior has a similarity to it. So I'm making a negative assumption that you're doing the same thing to me.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. So therapy really helped your wife because she was able to find a safe space to kind of revisit those childhood wounds, so to speak,
Yeah.
and to really address them. And then what are some of the courageous steps she had to make to help her heal from those things?
I think just facing the topic of sexual intimacy, it became a phobia because of, when people are sexually abused and they say 1 in 3 women have some type of unwanted sexual experience, 1 in 5 men have some type of unwanted sexual experience, people go one of two directions. They either become hypersexual, where they initiate sexual contact often so that they're in control, so that it can never be taken from them again. Or they become hyposexual, where they want nothing to do with it because it was such a horrible negative association for them. My wife went that way. And so I think one of the most courageous things she had to do, or she chose to do eventually, was slowly start facing the trauma, slowly start facing the phobia, because she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to read books about it. She definitely didn't want to actually engage sexually. So even seeing a couples therapist where we had to talk about it every week was her having to face, the trauma and the phobia. And so I think that was probably a huge, courageous thing that she had to do repeatedly, because there was multiple steps of facing the trauma. A lot of people, when they have trauma, and you'll see this a lot, and one of the coping mechanisms is avoidance. I don't want to think about that. Yeah, that's too bad. Or that's too hard. Or you go through a natural disaster like a hurricane. Like, I don't want to think about that. That was so horrific. And it's similar to that with sexual abuse. If you've been sexually mistreated, often a coping mechanism is avoidance. Like, I don't even want to go there. Don't even want to think about it. And that's fine if you're not in a committed relationship. But if you're in a committed relationship with someone who's higher libido, then that obviously becomes a big problem.
Right. Yeah. That's the reality. I'm married to a man that likes sex.
Yes. Yeah.
So were the steps for her then to like baby steps, stepping into sexual intimacy and just like, I'm okay here. This is safe.
Yeah.
I love this man. I'm invested in this relationship. This is good for me. Just slowly over time.
Yeah, I think it was both cognitive but also behavioral. So the behavioral was nesting. And so we had to go through a lot of exercises where we would be facing each other fully clothed, and we would not even be touching each other. but just like looking at each other. And
Uh-huh.
then she would have to track her anxiety level. Like how anxious did that proximity even make her?
Mm-hmm.
And then the moment she would start feeling anxious, we would pause, and then she would work on her breathing to get her breathing out of fight or flight or freeze and more into like a relax from her diaphragm, deep belly breathing. And then once she was relaxed, then we could go to the next step, which would be
Like hugging or something.
Yeah, like hugging or holding hands or putting our arms around each other with like direct eye contact. And so same thing. So we would kind of gradually have more and more physical contact, clothes on at first, non-sexual, eventually parts of clothing off, still non-sexual, and then eventually clothes off, sexual touching. But it was like a graduated exposure to the phobia.
Mm-hmm.
And every time it was very, very slow. I mean, we were in therapy for 5 years. And so it was very, very slow. But every time the anxiety would spike, then we would pause for her to ground herself.
Mm-hmm.
Because when she would get triggered, she would have an out of body experience and dissociate, and not really be there anymore. And that was her coping mechanism growing up. She would dissociate when the trauma was happening.
Mm-hmm.
So she would dissociate with us. So that was a behavioral approach that was really helpful, but there was also a lot of cognitive restructuring because she had a lot of negative tapes from her trauma, such as sex is bad, sex and love don't go together, anyone who wants sex is dirty and gross, I'm being used. And so she had all those negative tapes from her trauma that would come out toward me. Mm-hmm. That's the projection I was referring to. And so we also would have to pause for her to track, what am I thinking? How am I interpreting this right now? Mm-hmm. And often it was something like I just said, and she would have to pause and then reframe it to something truthful. Like, no, this is my committed husband. I'm not being used. Love and sex can go hand in hand. Things like that. And so the cognitive restructuring went hand in hand with lowering her anxiety as well.
That's great. All right. For your part, what things did you do differently than, like, you were at the beginning of your marriage, you're participating in making the situation worse in the beginning, right?
It was.
At what point did you realize, oh, I got to stop this? And what behaviors and changes did you make for yourself?
Yeah, I think the couples therapy, that's what was helpful for me as well, because I went into couples therapy thinking it's all her fault. Mm-hmm. She's the one who has to change. She's the problem.
Right.
A lot of couples do that, right? When they go into couples therapy and they've made up their mind who the problem is.
Fix them.
So that was
Fix
me.
her.
I definitely felt that. So through the couples therapy process, it was highlighted how, well, first of all, my anger reaction, that definitely was making everything worse, because then she didn't feel safe to even share where she was at and how she was feeling. Mm-hmm. And so one thing I had to learn is instead of sharing my anger, I had to get more in touch with my tender underbelly under the anger, which was hurt, feeling rejected, unwanted. And so I would have to just share those feelings. Like right now I'm feeling really unwanted, or I'm feeling really rejected or really hurt. Mm-hmm. That was one thing I had to work on. And that helped a lot because my wife, one of her top needs is emotional intimacy. So when she would hear me speak those kind of words, she would soften toward me. If I expressed the hard exterior, the anger, it would feel threatening and she would retreat. Mm-hmm. So that was one growth area I had to work on. Another growth area was just becoming more educated on the trauma cycle. When someone has trauma, often all they need is someone loving and supportive to help them cycle through the trauma.
Gotcha. To hold space for them.
That's right. Just to hold space and just to be there for them and say, hey, I'm here for you. I love you. It's okay. And so I also had to learn how to do that without taking it personal.
Gotcha.
And that was really hard because as the higher libido partner wanting to be sexually intimate, then she would get triggered and feel all these negative feelings toward me because I was the stimulus. So I had to learn, okay, it's not me. It's her trauma, even though she's projecting it toward me. And the best thing I can do right now is just hold the space, right? Just be supportive, be loving, let her cycle through the trauma spike and let it cycle through her system. because then I can be an ally through her triggers rather than an enemy making it worse.
Mhm. Before you were talking about that behavior intervention of like standing together, and when she would feel triggered, she needed to like breathe deeply to like self-regulate better, calm
Yeah.
herself down. I
Yeah.
can imagine you also in those moments, just as much, you needing to learn how to like self-regulate, calm yourself
Yes.
down.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of my journey had to be independent of her, because if I shared how I was feeling too
Hmm.
much, it would dysregulate her need to cycle through her trauma.
Hmm.
And that was another thing I had to learn. Like if I kind of hijack this experience and make it about me and how frustrated I am or how hard it is not to have sexual intimacy for such a long period of time, if I kind of hijack that, it aggravated her healing, because then she would feel like she had to just appease me, which would not allow her to then process through her trauma and tend
Hmm.
to her trauma.
Gotcha.
And so I had to learn that also. So I had to learn, like, no matter what I'm feeling, I
Hmm.
have to get my support somewhere else. So this is really about creating a safe relationship for her to feel secure, and whatever feelings that's stirring up for me, I have to get outside support for that and process through it elsewhere, or else it's going to complicate and aggravate her healing.
Gotcha. Did you find that support just through like other male friends,
Yeah,
church groups? I don't know where else you find.
yeah. I found it through some male friendships, and I also saw an individual counselor for myself for a while. So those were some good outlets for me to have
Hmm.
those sounding boards.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Cool, cool.
Hmm.
So, in today's culture, when a couple is facing a really serious challenge like the one you and your wife went through, it seems like the easy way out is the divorce card. Was that ever on the table? And how do you find the fortitude to see this through and be committed? Because now on the other end, things are so much better than they would have ever been.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, things are healthier and more connecting now in our marriage than they ever have been. And so I know firsthand what it feels like to be filled with resentment and hopelessness, but
Hmm.
also what it feels like to heal those resentments and fall back in love.
Hmm.
And so, the framing of the seasons of marriage is really helpful, I think, for this, where all marriages go through seasons, where it's summer, then fall, then winter, then spring. And we were definitely in winter, for a long time because of this toxic cycle.
Hmm.
Things were touch and go several times. And I have to be honest, more on my side than hers.
Hmm.
Her commitment to the relationship didn't waver near as much as mine did,
Hmm.
because of that continual just rejection, coupled with, for so long she was avoiding it, and so it felt hopeless. It felt like there was
Hmm.
no way this was going to improve. And so I definitely hit rock bottom personally multiple times. And there were seasons and moments where I wanted out and everything in me wanted to get a divorce. But I was really, from a values perspective, I was really committed to trying to have a covenant marriage where this is the long haul, except for adultery, abuse, and abandonment. And so that was kind of this value system I bought into before we got married. And so
Hmm.
that value system really helped me through those times, because I had to go in through my head. Is this abuse? No. Is it abandonment? No. Is it adultery? No. So therefore, in those dark moments, which I had a lot of, for me at least, the choice was, well, as long as she's willing to work at this, as long as she's willing to try to, improve this and open to seeking support, then I need to keep trying to. And so that was really the reason why, on my side, I never threw in the towel.
What advice do you have for a couple or a person in a marriage that feels a lot of resentment towards their spouse? Let's say, just example, uh, they're in a sexless marriage, and just over time, just with all the avoidance and everything, there's so much resentment built up. How do you? And because of that resentment, it's spilling out in every little conflict now. Every little thing turns into a power struggle in the relationship because there's all this resentment. How do you help someone address that? How do you help them heal? How do you help them resolve?
Yeah. This is the first thing I do with all couples I see in my practice, for the reason you're talking about. Because when there's active resentments, nothing else is going to go well in a relationship.
Right.
It's hard to go on dates with someone you resent. It's hard to have
Yes.
sex with someone you resent. And so what I do with couples I see, first session is I have them write down all the categories of resentment they have in their heart toward their partner. One analogy for resentments is it's rocks in the soil. And so if you're trying to plant something, those roots are not going to be able to take hold if there's rocks in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to first get out the rocks before you can plant so that the plant can then grow. So often we have to go backwards before we can go forwards.
Mm-hmm.
And going backwards means we have to tackle those resentments. So I have couples list out their top resentments they have in the marriage toward each other. Normally they each have like 4 to 6 categories. It's pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
And then I teach them one of my tools, which is called the Reunite tool. And the Reunite tool is a way to talk through resentments while keeping the conversation emotionally safe. Because most couples can't even talk about these topics without it blowing up.
Right.
And so then I train them on that tool. And then each session we tackle one resentment at a time using the Reunite tool. Sometimes it takes 2 sessions, depending on the complexity. But that is very effective because it provides a cathartic, safe way to talk through the topic. And it ends with action because the best way to say sorry is change behavior. But the behavior needs to be changes that are going to work for both partners. So it's sustainable. So anyway, so that kills 2 birds with 1 stone, where I'm teaching them the skill, the Reunite tool, while we're also working through resentments at the same time.
That's really good. Great. Any other advice you'd give to a couple struggling with what you've gone through and how to help them come out on the other end with success and healing?
Yeah. I mean, I would say sexual intimacy is a vital part to a healthy marriage. However, it has to be approached in a way that's going to work for both partners. And whether there's trauma or not trauma, learning how to cultivate, I call it the wedding cake model, which is the base. If you want a good sex life, the very first base you have to address is resentments. Once the resentments are addressed, then you move up and start working on your friendship. That's where dates come in, quality time, affection. Then once the dates are going good and the friendship is going good, emotional intimacy, then you move up and start having sensual time. And sensual time can be, cuddling, sensual massage, a bath or a shower with your bathing suits on, because not sexual. But the sensual time brings back the romance. And it allows you time to kind of enter into this special space of really enjoying one another sensually. And that allows time for the lower libido partner to build arousal as well. And then after the sensual time, if both partners are open to it, then you can move up into sexual contact. But view sexual contact as a buffet, not as a main course or nothing. So think of it as some nights, maybe we just do things above the waist. Or on other nights, maybe it's just manual below the waist. Or other nights, maybe it's oral. Maybe sometimes it's everything. But it's very important to bring back voice and choice to the low libido partner. Because low libido partners often feel like they have to have obligation sex. And when you're under obligation sex, your libido actually goes down. It gets
of course.
Worse. Yeah.
Right.
So obligation sex is not the solution. So bringing back voice and choice, where it can be a variety of things, is helpful for both, because then the low libido partner has that voice, has that choice. Then the high libido partner is going to experience some level of sexual contact more often because of that. Because for a low libido person, if the choices are intercourse or nothing, I'm going to choose nothing because I'm not up for the intercourse. And if you're low libido, and if you're a female, as most people know, arousal goes down after intercourse. For, I think it's 70% of females, arousal goes down because there's not enough clitoral stimulation. So actually, for a lot of females, the main event is all the foreplay. Right? So we have this distorted view of what the main event is. For a lot of females who are lower libido, it is all the foreplay. And so that needs to be our playground and where we spend the most time. So anyway, so that approach, resentments, then friendship, then sensual time, and then sexual contact. So if you're having problems in your sexual relationship, go through that pyramid. It's going to show you where you need the help. And if you address that area, it's going to have that effect all the way up the pyramid to help you with the sexual contact.
Very good. Where can people learn more about you and your work and where can people find you?
Sure. Yeah, the best place would be my podcast, The Dr. Wyatt Show. I put it out about once a week. Episodes are usually 15 minutes, very practical, to the point, 5 steps to do this, 6 steps to do that. So the Dr. Wyatt Show is a great way. My website is drwyattfisher.com, and I'm active on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and my handle is marriage_Dr. Wyatt.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Get Your Marriage On. And if you did, we would love it if you would take a few seconds to give us a rating on iTunes and to share the show with your friends. They'll thank you for life. Once you've done that, you can head over to getyourmarriageon.com for more resources about today's topic and to download our amazing marriage apps. Now go get your marriage on.